Where is your mind right now? Don't answer quickly. Don't point to your head by reflex. Pause for a moment and really feel the question. Where, exactly, is your mind at this moment? Most people never think about this. They simply assume the answer is obvious. The brain, the skull, that gray mass of a little over 1 kilo quietly pulsing behind the eyes. That's where you believe you think. That's where you believe you feel. That's where you believe you exist. But what if that automatic certainty is just conditioning? What if the most obvious answer is actually the most superficial? What if your mind is not inside your head, but in a space larger than your physical body? If you stay until the end, this question will fold in on itself and reveal something that completely changes how you understand who you are. And I'm going to leave you with an exercise to use in your daily life to increase your progress. For almost all of modern history, we've been trained to believe a very specific narrative. The brain generates the mind. Neurons fire, synapses connect. Electrical impulses travel through biological circuits, and at some point in this process, consciousness emerges. This idea became so dominant that it's rarely questioned. It sounds scientific, logical, safe. The problem is that it never explained the most important thing of all. It never explained how matter creates subjective experience. It never explained how electrical impulses turn into thoughts, how chemistry turns into meaning, how a cluster of cells produces the intimate feeling of being someone. This gap has always existed, but it was conveniently ignored. Until some researchers began measuring something that shouldn't have mattered, something that didn't fit the model, something that, if taken seriously, would require a complete inversion of everything. Valerie Hunt, a UCLA researcher, spent decades studying electrical signals in the human body. She wasn't a mystic. She wasn't trying to prove anything spiritual. Her work was technical, clinical, measurable. Using electromyography, she measured the electrical activity of muscles, tissues, and bodily systems. Everything looked normal, predictable, until she decided to expand the scope of the measurements to something that had, until then, been treated as irrelevant: the electromagnetic field surrounding the human body. Not the body itself, but the space around it. And that's when something impossible began to appear in the data. When a stimulus was presented, a sound, a touch, a light, the energy field reacted before the brain showed any corresponding signal. Not after, before. The field responded first, and only afterward did the brain show electrical activity related to the stimulus. This didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly, under controlled conditions, in replicable measurements. The pattern was clear. The field knew first. The brain followed. Faced with this, Hunt made a statement that should have rewritten entire neuroscience textbooks, but was largely ignored. She said the mind is not in the brain. It is in the field. Pause for a second and really absorb that. If the field responds before the brain, then the brain cannot be the origin of the mind. It cannot be the primary source of consciousness. At most, it is an intermediary, a translator, a signal processor coming from somewhere else. This means that your mind, what you call me, is not confined inside your skull. It exists in the field that surrounds your body, that passes through it, that extends beyond your skin. Every thought you've ever had, every emotion you've ever felt, every decision you've ever made did not happen inside your head, but in this larger space. And if this is true, an inevitable question arises. Who is really in control of your life? This question becomes even more unsettling when we look at another set of experiments that deeply shook the idea of free will. Benjamin Libet asked people to make simple decisions. Nothing emotional, nothing complex. Just move a finger whenever they wanted, spontaneously. Meanwhile, he measured brain activity with millisecond precision. What he discovered was uncomfortable. The brain initiated the action before the person became consciously aware of the decision. There was a delay of hundreds of milliseconds between the start of brain activity and the conscious sensation of, "I decided." In other words, the brain began acting before consciousness knew it had decided to act. This means conscious thought is not the starting point. It's the delayed narrator. The decision happens first at an unconscious level, and only afterward does consciousness step in to take credit. Now connect this with what Valerie Hunt observed. The field responds before the brain. The brain responds before conscious awareness. The order we were taught is completely inverted. It's not the mind inside the brain creating the field. It's the field informing the brain, and the brain informing surface consciousness. The voice here in your head is not the director of the film. It's the commentator who arrives late. And here everything starts to reorganize. Because if your mind is not confined to the brain, then your body is not the foundation of who you are. It is the result. It is the final manifestation of something more subtle, something invisible, yet structurally real. Your physical body is not the most fundamental level of your existence. It is the densest stage of a process that begins much earlier, at levels you were never trained to perceive. Your body is like a shadow projected on a wall. The field is the object casting that shadow. And most of humanity has spent its entire life trying to change the shadow, without ever touching the object. This explains something that always seemed strange. Why are so many attempts at change temporary? Why do so many treatments relieve symptoms but don't transform the cause? Why do so many people manifest small things but never deep, lasting change? Because they're working at the wrong level. They're trying to modify the effect, not the origin. They're pushing reality from the outside in, when reality organizes itself from the inside out. To understand this, you have to abandon the idea that the body is an isolated system. The body is a process. It is in constant regeneration. Skin cells renew in weeks. Blood renews in months. Even bones, which seem solid and permanent, are completely rebuilt over the years. Nothing in your body is static. So an inevitable question arises. If the body is always being rebuilt, from what blueprint is it being rebuilt? This is where the concept of field stops being abstract and becomes unavoidable. The body doesn't rebuild itself from nothing. It follows a blueprint, an informational template, a pattern. And that pattern is not stored only in DNA, because DNA alone doesn't explain variations in health, disease, regeneration, or collapse. The template is in the field, in the informational space that surrounds and permeates the physical body. The field is not a byproduct of the body. The body is a byproduct of the field. William Tiller, a Stanford physicist, spent decades studying exactly this relationship between consciousness, field, and matter. He proposed that the human field functions as an instruction system, an informational template that guides the organization of matter. The physical body does not decide what to build. It executes instructions. If the pattern in the field is coherent, the body expresses coherence. If the pattern in the field is distorted, the body expresses distortion. And this happens continuously, at every cycle of cellular regeneration. Tiller described this process as an information cascade. Information flows from the most subtle to the densest, from mental to emotional, from emotional to energetic, from energetic to physical. Once a pattern starts descending this cascade, it becomes fixed at each level, becoming harder to change the closer it gets to matter. That's why when a symptom appears in the body, it is not the beginning of the problem. It is the end of a process that has been unfolding for a long time. This completely changes how we understand disease, healing, and creation. Because if a pattern can descend from the subtle to the physical, it can also rise, but not in the same way. Trying to correct the pattern only at the physical level is like trying to change a file by editing only the printed copy. It might look like something changed, but at the next regeneration, the body prints the same pattern again. The origin remains intact. That's why so many people feel stuck in cycles. Cycles of symptoms, cycles of effort, cycles of trying and frustration. They are fighting their own shadow, without realizing the shadow has no power at all. The power is in the object casting it. The power is in the field. And here we reach a crucial point. If the field is the origin, then the most powerful level of intervention is not physical, it is mental. Not in the superficial sense of positive thinking, but in the deep sense of sustained mental patterns, internal images, emotionally charged beliefs. The mental level functions as the architect of the field. It defines the blueprint, and everything below it obeys. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If the mental level is so powerful, why can't most people change their reality just by thinking differently? Why does visualization work for some and not others? Why do so many people try, strive, believe, and still nothing changes? The answer is not a lack of merit. It's a lack of understanding of the mechanism. Because not every thought has the same weight. Not every image has the same power. Not every intention generates enough impact to alter an already established pattern. Old patterns are maintained by repetition, emotion, and identity. They don't dissolve with occasional thoughts. They require coherence. They require intensity. They require consistency. They require the mental level to truly change, not just the wish for it to change. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now. Just remember it when the time feels right. And this leads us to something even deeper, something almost no one realizes. Most people do not create their reality consciously. They create it unconsciously. They spend hours imagining negative scenarios, reliving traumas, anticipating problems, reinforcing fears. And they do this with intense emotional charge. The field responds to this. It always responds. It doesn't judge, it doesn't filter, it simply organizes matter according to the most consistent pattern it receives. The question was never whether you create your reality. You do. You always have. The question is whether you're doing it by design or by default. And now, before moving on, return to the initial question. Where is your mind right now? Because the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that this question is not rhetorical, it's operational. Knowing where your mind is means knowing where the leverage point exists. And what comes next reveals something even more radical. Because if the mind is not in the brain, if it exists in the field, then what you call the past, memory, identity, is also not where you think. And that's exactly where everything begins to fold in on itself. If the mind is not confined to the brain and the field responds before the body and surface consciousness, then what you call a thought is not just an internal event. It's an informational event. Each thought is a form. Each mental image is a structure. Each emotion is organized energy. And all of this exists first in the field, before any physical expression. The problem is that almost no one notices this while it's happening. Most people believe thinking is private, harmless, without real consequence. But at the level of the field, thought is action. When you sustain a mental image repeatedly, especially when it's emotionally charged, you're not just imagining. You're creating a stable pattern. That pattern installs itself at the mental level of the field and begins to exert pressure on the levels below it. First, the emotional level starts aligning with that image. Then the energetic level organizes around it. And over time, the physical body begins to respond, not as punishment or reward, but as a direct consequence of informational coherence. This explains why diseases rarely arise suddenly, even when they seem unexpected. Before the diagnosis, before the symptom, before the pain, there was already a pattern. A set of internal images, silent beliefs, recurring emotional states that were maintained over time. The body simply executes what the field has been instructing. When the symptom appears, it is the final stage of the process, not the first. It's the point where the invisible becomes visible. And that's exactly why trying to heal only the body almost always produces limited results. You can remove a symptom, but if the informational pattern that generated it remains intact, the system will rebuild it. The body is far too efficient to do anything other than what the field is ordering. It doesn't question, it obeys. And this doesn't apply only to disease. It applies to scarcity patterns, relationship repetition, creative blocks, self-sabotage. All of these are physical expressions of patterns that already exist at more subtle levels. Here comes the point that changes everything. The mental level is not just where thoughts arise, it is the command level. It's where the blueprint is defined. But don't confuse this with superficial thinking. It's not casual thought that shapes the field. It's sustained thought, repeated imagery, the internal narrative you tell yourself without noticing, what you believe to be true about who you are and how the world works. These beliefs don't stay in your head. They live in the field, and the field builds reality from them. This also explains why emotionally intense events leave such deep marks. Trauma is not just psychological memory. It's a collapse of coherence in the field. In moments of emotional shock, the entire system becomes highly malleable. The pattern formed their imprint strongly, not because the event was bad, but because emotion amplified the recording. The field learns fast when emotion is high, and it doesn't forget easily. But the same mechanism works in the opposite direction. Elevated states of emotional coherence, such as deep gratitude, intense presence, meditative states, or expansion experiences, also make the field highly plastic. In these moments, mental images have a disproportionately greater power to reorganize old patterns. Not because something magical is happening, but because the system is open to reprogramming. This leads to an uncomfortable realization. Most people spend their entire day reinforcing exactly what they don't want. They imagine the problem more than the solution. They feel the fear more than the possibility. They feed the old pattern while waiting for something new to happen. And then they wonder why nothing changes. The field doesn't respond to occasional desires. It responds to sustained coherence. And here, an inevitable question arises. If the field responds before the brain, if decisions are made before consciousness notices, if patterns are being reinforced beyond the reach of conscious thought, then how do you access this deeper level? How do you work directly with the field, rather than just the surface of the mind? Because if real change doesn't happen at the level of conscious effort, then it must happen at a more fundamental level. And that's exactly what most approaches ignore. They try to use willpower to reprogram something that doesn't respond to force. The field responds to coherence, not effort. It responds to alignment between thought, emotion, and identity. And this brings us to something even more radical. Because if the field stores patterns, then it also stores information, not just about the present, but about the past. And when we understand this, the very idea of time begins to dissolve. If the field stores patterns, then it is not limited to the present moment. It functions as a continuous informational medium where experiences don't simply pass and disappear, but remain encoded as structures. What we call memory is not stored only in the brain. The brain accesses it. The field retains it. This explains why certain emotions, fears, or reactions arise without apparent cause. The body responds to information that is not being consciously remembered, but remains active in the field. That's why the past is not really behind you. It is distributed as accessible information, not as a repeating movie, but as patterns ready to be reactivated whenever they find coherence with the present. When someone relives a trauma, they are not just remembering. They are re-entering a still active pattern. Time, at this level, is not linear. It is informational. This also clarifies reports of spontaneous access to information the person never studied, never consciously lived, yet that emerges with unexpected accuracy. Not because the brain created something from nothing, but because the field does not operate under the same temporal limitations as matter. Information doesn't need to move through time. It simply becomes accessible when internal conditions allow. When the field enters specific states of coherence, such as in deep meditation, near-death experiences, or intense states of presence, the brain's interface relaxes and access expands. Not because something external enters, but because the noise diminishes. The filter loosens. What was always there can be perceived. This means you are not trapped by your past in the way you were taught to believe. You are simply coherent with it. And coherence can be changed. When the pattern shifts at the field level, the relationship with the past shifts as well. Memory loses charge. Identity reorganizes. The body responds. Not because time was healed, but because the pattern that kept that time active stopped being fed. And now everything comes together. Because if the mind is not in the brain, if the field responds before consciousness, if patterns shape matter and time is informational, then the initial question returns with even more weight. Where is your mind right now? Because depending on where it is, it may be repeating the past or redesigning what hasn't happened yet, and this is exactly where we need to end. So we return to the beginning. Where is your mind right now? After all this, that question can no longer be answered by pointing to your head, because now you know the brain is not the origin. It's the interface. The mind doesn't originate there. It passes through there. It exists in the field that precedes thought, that informs the body, that organizes matter before you perceive anything. When you understand this, something quietly shifts. You realize you're not trying to change reality from the right place when you fight only with conscious effort. The true leverage point was never willpower. It was always the pattern you sustain when no one is watching, the kind of images you hold, the emotional state you normalize, the coherence you repeat every day without noticing. The field does not respond to what you occasionally want. It responds to what you consistently are. It builds from identity, not desire. And identity is nothing more than a pattern stabilized over time. When that pattern changes, everything changes with it. The body, the choices, the opportunities, the world's responses. Not because reality obeys you, but because you finally started operating at the same level at which reality organizes itself. And here the circle closes, because at the beginning I asked where your mind was. Now the question is different. Where has it been all this time? Trapped in old patterns, repeating inherited images, reinforcing stories that no longer make sense, or ready to move into a broader level, where thought becomes instruction and consciousness becomes creation. The mind was never in the brain. It was always in the field, in the space where possibility hasn't yet become form, in the place where the past can still be reorganized and the future has not yet been printed. And now that you know this, the question is no longer philosophical, it's practical. What are you going to sustain in that field from now on? Because your mind is already there. It always has been, and the field has always been. Listening. Now you can see the exercise in the description. Now that you understand how the mind, the field, and reality actually work, there is one step you can't skip. Understanding this intellectually is not enough. The field doesn't respond to concepts, it responds to state. That's why I'm leaving on your screen now the previous video, where I talk about recognition and internal alignment. It helps you realize that you didn't arrive here by accident and puts your consciousness in the position where this knowledge can actually be applied. Without that, this stays as information. With it, it becomes experience.